r/AskReddit. What is the most interesting fact about a historical figure that most people don't know about? Abraham Lincoln's wife remembered the last words they spoke to one another. She took his hand and held it before the play began. And leaned in to whisper, "Is it alright if we hold hands like this?" Due to his office. Lincoln then leaned towards her and whispered, "Yes. That's quite alright." And then they watched the rest of the play in that position. Roman Emperor Caligula was so upset by the death of his sister Drusilla that he imposed a year of mourning. During this time, everyone in the empire was forbidden to dine with his family, laugh or take a bath. The penalty for transgression was death. Winston Churchill used to put needles in his cigars. He would smoke these cigars at important meetings and the cigars would never ash. The people in attendance would be distracted by the cigar and not pay attention to what he was saying. Abraham Lincoln was the only president to have been a licensed bartender. President James Garfield could write both Greek and Latin at the same time, each hand simultaneously writing. Vice President Andrew Johnson took his presidential oath when he was completely drunk. Erwin Rommel, one of Hitler's top generals, was highly respected by both German and Allied soldiers. Not only was he a very capable military officer, but he was also against much of Hitler imposed. His soldiers in Africa were never accused of war crimes and he refused to execute Jewish soldiers as commanded. He was even involved in a plot to kill Hitler. Hitler was a troop in World War I and never rose through the ranks because he was told that he never had any leadership potential. Winston Churchill, when having other leaders over for meetings, would straighten out a paper clip and then insert it into his cigar. He would then remove all ashtrays from the room that the meeting was being held in. When the other person arrived, they would be offered a cigar to smoke with him. While smoking, negotiating, or whatever they were doing, soon the visitor would start looking around for an ashtray to dump their ash into. There was none to be found. Meanwhile, Churchill's would be inexplicably staying attached to his cigar. Eventually the visitor would have to yield and ask for an ashtray, giving Churchill a psychological victory in the negotiations. If you were holding a conversation with Lyndon Johnson and he needed to use the restroom, he would simply bring you along and continue talking while he went about his business. Hitler hated cruelty to animals. Ben Franklin was allergic to wig powder, so he almost never wore a wig. That's why he always looks a bit scraggly in all his likenesses. I'm not sure if this qualifies, but John Tyler's grandsons are still alive. Dude was president in the 1840s. Grover Cleveland once said to a young Franklin D. Roosevelt, "My son, I hope you never become president of the United States. It's funny whenever I think about it." Richard the Lionheart, famous English king and crusader, could not speak English. Edit. He spoke French for those wondering. Edit 2. Don't hate on me because I posted it and you consider it common knowledge. Hate on those who don't know. The Bushes are from Connecticut, not Texas. After killing over 400 Native Americans at the Battle of Talladega, Andrew Jackson kept a child he orphaned and raised him as his son. Jackson was even planning to pull strings to get him into West Point. Old Hickory was ruthless and decidedly an asshole, but he wasn't totally heartless. President Ford was never elected to anything higher than the US House of Representatives. For the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Gavrilo Princip was merely one of about 5 assassins. The others either failed or were caught, and Princip went to a cafe, disheartened. By chance, the vehicle carrying the Archduke and his wife made a wrong turn on the parade route and was turning around just outside of the cafe at which Princip was hanging out. Princip then exited the building and killed them both. Guess this is more of an interesting historical anecdote than a fact about one person, but I thought it fit. Edit. Row. Thanks for all the karma, guys. Happy New Year. Kurt Gödel, the mathematician who proved the incompleteness theorem, developed a paranoid delusion that someone was trying to poison him. He refused to eat anything not prepared by his wife. After she died, he starved to death. Robert E. Lee, only man to ever be offered the job of general by both sides before a war. Martin Luther King Jr., Plagiarized much of his doctoral thesis. Sundiata the Lion Prince of Mali was the only family member spared when a rival took over his father's city-state. Because he was a cripple and deemed not a threat, he ended up not only avenging his family by retaking over the city-state, but he ended up founding one of the most successful kingdoms in African history. Besides being generally awesome, Teddy Roosevelt was integral in creating the NCAA and college football as we know it today. The book Ulysses S. Grant changed his name from Hiram Ulysses Grant because of a mistake at West Point regarding his name. He kept the name change because he liked avoiding the initials HUG. The S in his name is also nonsensical. And speaking of presidential S middle names, Truman's is for both of his grandfather's names, Ship and Solomon. The S just stands for S, but represents his parents' indecisiveness. Hitler was addicted to methamphetamine by the end of World War II. Kind of interesting that a man who was a non-drinking vegetarian who had little tolerance for smokers was taking one of the most potent drugs known to man. Nikola Tesla was a goddamn madman when he wasn't being brilliant. He had a pigeon obsession, refused to stay in certain rooms based on their number, and was for a time convinced that a device of his caused the Tunguska blast in Siberia. Abraham Lincoln was an incredibly famous and talented wrestler, and would take challenges from anyone who offered. John F. Kennedy, C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia, and Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, all died on the same day. Edit. It was November 22, 1963. I study religion and have done some study on early church history in the Christian movement. A few years ago I learned that Saint Nicholas of Myra, Santa Claus, was part of the First Council of Nicaea. The meeting held after Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire in order to discuss the various theologies. At the council there was a man named Arius who proposed a heretical theology called Arianism, which is an explanation of the Trinity that defines it as one God with two lessers. Angry at this theology, Nicholas punched Arius in the face. TLDR, Santa Claus punched a guy in the face. Andrew Jackson beat an assassin with his cane after both of the assassin's pistols misfired. Edit. Some more badass facts about Andrew Jackson. When he was inaugurated he was so popular that a mob formed and raided the White House to see him. He paid off all national debt for the first and only time in American history. During one of Jackson's many duels he was shot near the heart. He covered the bullet hole with his hand, fired, and killed his opponent. The bullet stayed in his chest until he died. During the War of 1812 a British force of 7,500 troops threatened to take New Orleans. Jackson repelled the attack with only 71 casualties. For the battle he enlisted the help of pirates. That's right. He fought off the British with an army of pirates. His pet parrot had to be removed from his funeral due to its vulgar language. He fought in approximately 100 duels. Abraham Lincoln was scared of the dentist. Osama bin Laden loved him some girl-on-girl porn. Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt were given elaborate samurai suits by the Japanese during their respective terms. Also, Teddy was really into Japanese culture. Also, Andrew Jackson once dueled a man and lost. During the struggle, he was shot in the arm and would have lost it had he not threatened the doctor who was planning on amputating it. The duel was started over, I believe, an insult directed towards Andrew Jackson's wife. The man who nearly killed him in this duel later became his closest friend and political ally. And when Jackson was upon his deathbed, this man wrote Jackson's memoirs at his bedside. For the life of me, I can't recall this man's name. Betsy Ross won a horse in a bare-knuckle fight with a drunken British duke. After defeating him she was quoted as saying, "Next time send your wife." Teddy Roosevelt is the only person to win the Nobel Peace Prize and the Medal of Honor, the highest award for peace and war respectively. He also had the best named horse that he rode into battle. The horse's name? Little Texas. Socrates, whenever he couldn't find his, wore the clothes of his wife. George Washington was a ginger. Napoleon wasn't actually that short. He was 5'7". Bob Marley's dad was white. He was a British officer stationed in Jamaica. Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes, once sent a letter to his friends saying, "We have been discovered. Flee immediately." And 3 of them disappeared. Even though he hadn't done anything. Edit. Okay, so this one probably isn't true. Or it could have been Mark Twain. Thanks Aeolus. But it still makes a good story. Thanks for the correction, internet. Lenin spoke English with a posh Irish accent. Hitler and Napoleon I share the same birthday. The 20th of April. It's also my sister's. I'm worried. Abraham Lincoln was challenged to a duel by a Democrat named James Shields. Shields changed his mind when Lincoln stipulated that the duel would take place on a remote island. And the weapons used would be broadswords. Article. At the Siege of Tyre, Alexander the Great built a causeway to connect the land to the island. So he can kick their ass. It remains connected today. http://ancientinvestigation.files.wordpress.com/2009/06/tyre_satellite.jpg. Here is one. Benjamin Franklin did not flew a kite during a thunderstorm. It was his son who did. Bonus. John F. Kennedy warned MLK that J. Edgar Hoover was creating an FBI file on him in order to discredit him. Al Bundy once scored 4 touchdowns in a single game. James K. Polk. Most people have never heard of him. He was the 11th President of the United States. After Thomas Jefferson. James K. Polk increased the size of the United States more than any other president through the acquisition of California and New Mexico as a result of the Mexican-American War and the Oregon Territory after a treaty with England. He was also a very effective leader during the Mexican-American War. He lowered tariffs, increasing trade, and after all of that he decided not to run for a second term. That is why Young Hickory is my favorite president. Plus a catchy song. Ty Cobb played his whole baseball career with a bullet lodged in his shoulder blade area. Tutankhamun's wife sent a note to the Hittite king after he died saying, "I am afraid." She asked him to send one of his sons to marry her. Hittites were historical enemies. But there were no royals left for her to marry in Egypt. Source: The Murder of Tutankhamun, the 1st of March, 1999. ISBN 0-425-16689-9. Charlie Chaplin once entered a Charlie Chaplin lookalike contest and came in 2nd place. Edit. It was actually 3rd place. John F. Kennedy was racked with Crohn's disease and had a bad back. Shortly before the fateful trip to Dallas, he re-injured his back banging a Washington, D.C. hooker on an office desk. This forced him to wear a back brace the day of the assassination. The back brace prevented him from ducking down after he was hit with the first shot, which was not fatal. This left him a sitting target for the second hit, which was Charles Gitto, the assassin of President Garfield, was a member of a sex cult in Oneida, New York. He was kicked out for making the other members uncomfortable. Gitto was the only member of this sex cult who could not get anyone to have sex with him. Alan Turing was actually relatively open about his sexuality. He never hid the fact he was gay. When he was arrested, he reminded the police that there was an inquiry into decriminalizing homosexuality. Johann Sebastian Bach was banned from his church in the evenings. You see, Herr Bach used to like to stick around and work on his compositions well into the night. As a result, Mrs. Bach got into the habit of bringing him his supper, so he wouldn't starve. You understand? And, well, one thing would lead to another. And since those old cathedrals had such magnificent acoustics, TL, Dr. loudly fucking in churches. Gandhi was a dirty old man. When he wanted to share his bed with his 19-year-old grandniece Manu Gandhi, he wrote to her father and told him that they were sharing a bed so that he could correct her sleeping posture. His stenographer later found him naked sleeping with Manu. Mansa Musa gave away so much gold to the poor on his pilgrimage to Mecca that he devalued gold for over a decade in many Mediterranean cities. causing mass inflation. Joan of Arc was not burned for being a witch but for cross-dressing. Were it not for Benjamin Franklin and his late-night partying and debauchery with French aristocrats, we would not have won the Revolutionary War. He made himself a celebrity among the French. When his ship arrived, people greeted him wearing coon hats because that was the American stereotype. Ben Franklin even wore them himself to enforce the novelty and keep his image as positive as possible. Why did he do all of this? Because he had to sell the idea to the most successful members of a monarchistic society of helping the Americans commit high treason and overthrow a king. If you want to get nothing in return, you can like and join my Discord. There is a link in the description.